Please pray with me. Startle us, O God, with your word. Silence in us any voice but your own. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Think of a time when your own social norms were challenged. When you first realized that how you or how your family does things is not the way everyone else might do things. I was a second grader, and I had just been invited to my first non-Asian friend's home. She was a classmate of mine, Megan, and her mom was the class parent. I rode home with them after school, and when we got to their house, they just walked right in. They didn't stop at the door to take off their shoes. There was no shoe rack or designated area to leave your shoes. They just walked inside their home with the same shoes they had been wearing all day outside their home. I remember standing there, 8 years old, at the door, temporarily frozen, so confused and so uncomfortable, trying not to judge how wrong and how unclean this all felt to me. In my mind, I'm thinking, why would you wear your outside shoes inside your home? Do you know what you step on outside? But trying to be a good guest, I took a deep breath, followed them in, wearing my shoes that had never been worn inside a home ever before. If I were Peter, perhaps a vision of shoes would have come down. Shoes that were clean and unclean, shoes that had been worn inside and outside, letting me know that it was okay. It was gonna be okay. Some people just do things differently than you do. Now, my story obviously makes light of a very key, pivotal moment in Christian history. But it is that same kind of unmooring that we feel when we first realize that the world and God are so much bigger and greater and more diverse than you thought that you ever could have imagined. Now, for Peter and this first community of Jesus followers, this vision and his actions were monumental. It determined in a whole new way who's in and who's out, what's allowed, and perhaps more importantly, who's allowed. You see, prior to this story, to belong to this early Christian community, you had to first become just like them. You had to follow eating practices, their rituals, and if you were male, your body had to conform through circumcision. You had to physically and spiritually and practically conform to one very particular way of being in the world. And this story of Peter, including the Gentiles just as they are, is breaking through thousands of years of convention and social norms and long-held beliefs of how it should be done. You can hear them, can't you? We've never done it that way before, Peter. This is the way it's always been done. Or, Peter, we have to do things decently and in order. Guilty of that phrase myself. Or that great conflation. This is not just my way or God's way, it's the only right way to do this. Now, what Peter has done is an act of inclusion that we all continue to benefit from. I may be wrong, but I'm guessing 99.9% of us here today are what Peter's community would have considered Gentiles. And in the 2,000 years since Peter's vision, we may have come to take for granted that our race, our ethnicity, our nationality would have precluded us from belonging to that very first Christian community. If not first by the grace of God, of course, but also for Peter and his vision of inclusion, we would not be sitting here this morning. Peter proclaims, "The Spirit told me to go with them, these outsiders, the Gentiles, and not to make a distinction between them and us. Who was I that I could hinder God?" he asks. There is no longer us and them and us. The divisions that we have created as people are erased by God's love and Jesus' invitation to follow him. Now, that doesn't mean our differences are erased. It means our divisions are erased, two very different things. In fact, if anything, Peter is trying to preserve the differences, isn't he? The Gentiles no longer have to conform to Jewish practices in order to become a part of this community. You can be circumcised, or you don't have to be circumcised. You can eat meat and all those four-footed animals, or you can still refrain from eating meat and those four-footed animals. You can be a part of this community with the fullness of who you are. So this vision doesn't make us all the same, but it does make us one. It makes us united, but not uniform. Accepted without having to assimilate to the dominant culture. The divisions are erased, but the differences are preserved and even celebrated as part of God's good gift of diversity. This story of radical inclusion, of social norms and customs that were thrown aside to welcome the other, of a community that celebrated a unity that is possible in the midst of diversity. That is the story of our faith, of this tradition that purports to follow Jesus. And yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still drawing lines in the sand, still trying to figure out who gets to come in and who gets left out, who belongs and who doesn't, what's allowed and what isn't. We continue to still sinfully consider whether or not to accept the full humanity of women, of our LGBTQI sisters and brothers, of migrants south of the border, when God has already declared, yes, 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 and yes again. He belongs, she belongs, they belong, you belong, just as you are, just as God created you. You have a place at God's table. You are claimed and named as beloved. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not yet seen this vision that Peter received, and it would behoove them to read again and again Acts 11 until the Spirit convicts them. The Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor, prolific author and theologian, says, "The only clear line I draw these days is this. When my religion tries to come between me and my neighbor, I will choose my neighbor. Jesus never commanded me to love my religion." And that's what's incredible about this story from Acts. It's the response of the people. Peter tells them the story of this encounter he's had with those whom they've considered the other. And as one commentator puts it, the Spirit gives them the ability to listen and to change. The community that initially brings all of their criticisms to Peter is able to be transformed by this story of radical welcome. They come to realize that they cannot hinder what God is doing, what God has already done. So rather than choosing to love their religion, they choose to love their neighbor. That's what gets me about the news cycle this week and the talking heads who are so adamantly pro-birth, yet do nothing to then care for and preserve life once it is here. So many who spoke up for these anti-choice laws in Alabama and Missouri this week hide behind their so-called religion, all the while failing to love their neighbor, let alone see her as human. Statistics show that abortion rates go down in countries and in administrations where there is a social net to care for those who are suffering from poverty, where all children can have access to health care, to food, to housing, where youth and young adults receive education, sex education that is comprehensive and includes family planning. That, to me, is a plan that is actually for life, because it recognizes the interconnectedness of all life. Justice and equity is necessary to preserve life in its fullness. So we can legislate whatever out-of-touch laws we want, but that won't preserve or honor life until justice and equity for people who are already living are a part of that conversation. If we were unsure before, it seems quite clear these days that we are indeed a broken people. And perhaps it is human nature to want to control one another, to want to have our beliefs validated and forced on others, to want to declare who's in or who's out, to want to belong to an us, and in so doing, create a them. I know that deep within our DNA lies these survivalist tendencies that tell us that tribalism, finding those who are like us, will protect us from outside threats. But our faith challenges us to see the humanity of all people, to risk relationship, even with those we might not really understand, to find a way to love, even if we don't always like. For Christians, there is no us and them. Rather, one sacred humanity created in the image of God, and that is challenging. It's challenging for me. I'm sure it is challenging for us all, but that is the challenge that we are called to by God. Nadia Boltz-Weber is a Lutheran pastor with tattoo sleeves up and down her arms. She began a congregation called House for All Sinners and Saints. She is staunchly Lutheran, but also fairly progressive, and she writes this in one of her books using much more colorful language than I will use this morning. She says, after one of my more finely worded rants about stupid people who have the wrong opinions, a friend said to me, Nadia, the thing that sucks is that every time we draw a line between us and others, Jesus is always on the other side of it. And that's the problem with creating these false dichotomies of us and them. Because if we think that Jesus is on our side of the line, the reality is Jesus is probably on the other side of the line, perhaps erasing those lines like we see on the bulletin cover this morning, or perhaps inviting us to learn how to draw some circles, right? Circles with ever-expanding circumferences that include everyone. There is no us and them. This is especially difficult for me to profess in a time when we are so polarized, when anyone who disagrees with an opinion is demonized and characterized as somehow less than human. But even in this climate, or perhaps even more so in this climate, it is necessary to proclaim, we belong to each other, and we need each other. There is no us and them, and we must find a way to work together for our common humanity. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this. He wrote in a letter from a Birmingham jail, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." As a minister and civil rights leader, Dr. King knew this to be true. But scientists now tell us that this is true. It's not just our faith that compels us, but empirical data that shows us that this is the case. We need each other, and we all do better when we all do better. There is no us and them, just all of us together, equally beloved by God. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can go about repairing the world in places where we have failed to live up to that. Rachel Held Evans was a Christian writer who died all too soon, and she said it like this: "What I love about the ministry of Jesus is that he identified the poor as blessed and the rich as needy, and then he went and ministered to them both. This, I think, is the difference between charity and justice. Justice means moving beyond the dichotomy between those who need and those who supply, and confronting the frightening and beautiful reality that we desperately need one another." Friends, we must move beyond our false dichotomies and live into the frightening yet beautiful reality that we are actually all one, all connected, all in need of one another. Divisions will always threaten to conquer us, but we are not playing a zero-sum game. There is enough for all of us to live abundantly, to love deeply, and to be treated and seen in the fullness of our humanity. God has already proclaimed it so. So we must now go forth and co-create a world where Peter's vision becomes a reality in our world this day. Let us pray for such a world. Let us work for such a world. And now, as you are able, please rise and we will sing for such a world.